One thing I've said a few times now over the course of the many years I've been doing these videos is that the era of the privateer is done. They are never coming back, and we'll never see a privateer in the way that we used to see them ever again. But on the current grid, would you call any of them privateers? I suppose that depends on what your definition of a privateer is. Is it a team not run by a manufacturer? In which case, that's Red Bull, Credit Cards Be Us, Williams and Haas. But Red Bull is run by a multinational drinks company, as is Contactless Payments for You. Williams is no longer owned by the family and has had previous investments and shareholders from outside before, and now Haas has a technical partnership with Toyota. You know, that small company, Toyota. But before that, there was Sauber, which is now Audi, and they had the same things going on as well. Red Bull invested in the team in the 90s, with Dietrich Mateschitz being a prominent shareholder, and then there was investment from the Swiss banks and businessmen that helped the team to survive during the 2000s. That and the fact that they were building clones of the previous year's Ferrari, and that was dominating, so that was also a big help for them. And the wind tunnel they had was pretty advanced for the time. A wind tunnel that Bugatti wanted to test for the Veyron, only for Sauber to say, sorry lads, we don't go that high. But what I'm trying to refer to here is the true privateer, where it was all a one-man operation and the way money came in was from prize money, sponsorship and maybe a driver or two with a few quid to spare. It's how those back-of-the-grid teams found in the archives of the F1 Rejects website survived. That and a few dodgy sponsorship deals here and there. The secret ingredient is crime. But teams like Tyrrell managed to survive on a shoestring budget until the money totally dried up, and Ken Tyrrell offloading his team was kind of the beginning of the end. Minardi was also selling shares and would offload his team at the end of the 90s, but then you had the likes of Arrows as well, lasting a decent amount of time before also collapsing at the turn of the 21st century. Well, Minardi didn't exactly collapse, they just got sold. Now, the privateers still in F1, that being Haas and Williams, are made up the way they are, otherwise they wouldn't survive. But there was one privateer team that lasted a little bit longer than all the others, and he managed to do it his own way, doing stuff the old-fashioned way, bringing money in through sponsors and prize money and everything else. He had no sugar daddy, no external investment, and certainly no manufacturers buying their way in. That man was Eddie Jordan, the leader of the eponymous rock and roll underdogs. The recently departed and heavily missed Eddie Jordan was one of Formula One's proper blokes, able to run a team without having to resort to sponsorships from people that were all talk and no cash, and not just becoming a racing team that might as well be branded WeSignAnyBloke.com. They had a stable-ish driver lineup in the 90s, they had an engine supply contract, and in the years leading up to this story, they'd been sponsored by the South African oil company Sasol, which is a period of Jordan's history that we looked at in a video at some point last year. The colourful cars, the young driver lineup, the Hart engines, well, all of it really. And for Eddie, that Sasol backing was a lifeline, something that the smaller teams need and require a constant supply of. While Williams, Benetton, McLaren and so on had works engine deals, big money tobacco sponsorship and success and brand appeal, they were able to be Super Mario speedrunning his way to the flag at the end of the level. Eddie, on the other hand, was collecting coins, so he got to 100 of the coins and would get the extra life. An extra life that teams like his would be very grateful to have, because for them, the sponsorship could be pulled in an instant. And Eddie also had the memories of Benetton rug-pulling Schumacher fresh in his mind, as well as the cars being impounded at the 1991 Belgian Grand Prix because he hadn't paid a few bills. But all that said though, Eddie had done a lot of good in the sport. He was a survivor, and Jordan would likely survive as they were doing stuff on meagre budgets that other teams weren't or couldn't. Jordan had fast become the benchmark for any privateer team entering the sport, and the exploits of teams like Life and Andrea Moda either side of him had made that 5th place Constructors' Championship finish in their debut season seem like a fluke or a miracle, depending on who you ask. But by the end of 1995, things weren't looking great for the rock and roll misfits. But the thing is, they weren't known for that just yet. The face of Formula One was changing, and Jordan would have to start hunting for those coins, literally and metaphorically. Things happening in Formula One around the Jordan team at the end of 1995 were making them look at the accounts and making them think, we might be screwed here, in Irish. For one, the Sasol sponsorship had ended at the conclusion of the 1994 season, and that was for multiple reasons. Number one being that there'd been a devaluation of South Africa's currency, the rand, against other international currencies, such as the pound and the US dollar, and also because Jordan had lost Hart engines and gained Peugeot ones. Since Sasol had built up a good working relationship with Hart, they transferred their backing over to the Footwork team, who got the Hart engines for 1995. With further devaluation, Sasol withdrew from Formula One entirely at the end of 1995. Jordan, meanwhile, had been given a new look for 1995, as they were Total Jordan Peugeot that year, which makes complete sense. In fact, it makes total sense. You got Total, the French fuel people, and Peugeot, the French car people. Total still works with Peugeot even today, with them partnered with the Peugeot hypercar team in the WEC. And while we're on the subject, Le Mans Ultimate has got the new hypercar tyres now, so who would be up for me and Fraser doing some stuff in the Valkyrie at some point? But anyway, that had helped Jordan through 1995, but the deal was going to be less for 1996. And that was going to be a problem. Eddie Jordan had said at the start of the 1996 season that he'd basically done everything there was to do in motorsport at that point. He'd won everything in the junior categories, he'd been second, third, got pole position and got a fastest lap. The only thing left to do for him was to win a race, and he wanted to do that more than anything else. But he wasn't going to win anything without funding, and like mentioned before, there were things falling apart around him. At the end of the 1995 season, Pacific and Simtech had collapsed. LaRue's the year before, and with them had gone Lotus of all people. Yeah, that Lotus. Jim Clark, Graham Hill, Emerson Fittipaldi, Mario Andretti. Lotus. In the Jordan F1 team's lifetime, Brabham had gone, March had gone, and 40 was hanging on by a thread as well, and they would collapse mid-1996, although there were other factors at play with 40. More than anything else, Eddie needed a safety net. Jordan was actually the first team to get their 1996 specification car onto a track, presumably to attract sponsors, and also they allegedly slammed fastest laps in to make them look more appealing. That car had tested in the previous year's colours of light blue and white, with no sponsorship decals covering the car other than the parts suppliers. Getting a new title sponsor for 1996 onwards would be the difference between surviving into the 21st century or ending up like all the others, and the F1 dream coming to an end. Rumours were going around in early 1996 that the Jordans would have a colour change at some point, with Camel cigarettes being touted as being their new sponsor. But these rumours, along with rumours that Lucky Strike were going to be involved, were apparently attempts by rival teams to get the actual new sponsor to back off. That new title sponsor, announced just before the start of the 1996 season, was Benson Hedges, so the Jordans would be painted yellow after all. Well, I mean, sort of, because the 1996 car was a slightly different colour to what we became used to. The new Jordan 196 was unveiled to the world at some point prior to the start of the season in a very striking colour, a mustardy yellow colour that changed a bit later on. The car was essentially an update of the previous year's car, with the modifications to bring it up to 1996 standards. So that being wider and longer cockpits, the blunted end plates on the front wing, the deletion of aero deflectors in front of the rear wheels, and the raised cockpit sides. The main difference between the 1995 and 1996 cars, besides the colour, was that Jordan had joined the rest of the grid except Ferrari in having a fully raised nose, as Gary Anderson saw the potential of shoving air through the centre of the car and was a design choice that everybody had gone with by this point. But the Benson and Hedges deal had become a massive boost to Jordan's hopes for 1996. The deal was multi-year and worth a whopping $15 million per season. And not only that, at the time, Benson and Hedges was the 5th best-selling cigarette brand behind Marlboro, Mild 7, Winston and Camel. And 2 of those brands were in F1 already, Winston sponsoring NASCAR. But not only was it a big deal, it was unexpected, because Benson and Hedges didn't do international sponsorship. They were sponsoring the snooker at the time, being the sponsor for the Masters, but that was more a UK thing. The thing with brands like Benson's is that different companies own the brand in different markets. Also, make this make sense. You couldn't have tobacco logos on your cars at the British Grand Prix, but the Snooker Masters was sponsored by Benson and Hedges and the World Championship was sponsored by Embassy. I don't get that at all. If you're a lawyer, do let me know how they managed to get away with that. Outside of the European Union, Benson's was owned by BAT. In the United States, it was owned by Philip Morris. For reference, in Europe, the brand was owned by Gallagher, who were previously involved in racing through Silk-Cut on the Jaguar Group C cars. But the funny part about all this is, when racing in non-European markets, BAT would be getting free advertising for their cigarettes. Gallagher, in turn, is or was a subsidiary of American Brands, which owns Jim Beam, White & McKay Whiskey, and was even involved in golfing equipment at one point or another. But what it meant now is that all of the front to mid-running teams except Sauber now had investment in one way or another from a tobacco brand. So how did this new era go for Jordan then through 1996? Not great, is the answer. 1995 had shown a lot of promise, but when they got to 1996, Eddie and the rest of the team were simply left whelmed. Eddie Irvine had left to go to Ferrari, and in was Martin Brundle, who had driven for Eddie in the juniors. They now had a very experienced driver alongside Barrichello, who was staying on for one more season, and the hope was that things would go well for them and that the car would make gradual progress. At the first round in Australia, Barrichello stuck his car on the 4th row of the grid down in 8th, while Brundle qualified well off the pace down in 19th, ahead of only Pedro Diniz in the Ligier, as both the 40s had failed to qualify, and even the Minardis had been faster than them both. But the race was going to get worse from there as the 1996 season began with a massive bang. As the field screamed its way down towards turn 3, a lazy in the Benetton moved across in front of Hakkinen and Barrichello to take the racing line, and in doing so he caused a chain reaction behind him. At the back of the accordion effect, Coulthard in the McLaren had to brake hard to avoid hitting Panis and move to the left towards Herbert Sauber. Brundle, caught in the middle, vaulted over the back of the McLaren and the Sauber and did a full barrel roll, with the chassis snapping in two as he went over. The race was stopped and Brundle managed to take the restart after being cleared by Professor Watkins. At the restart though, he tangled with Diniz, spun and stalled at exactly the same spot that he had that previous accident. Barrichello meanwhile would retire on lap 29 when the engine went on strike. Barrichello did manage to go incredibly well at Brazil, as he often did, sticking his Jordan in second place for that particular Grand Prix. But this race formed part of that run of successive Brazilian Grand Prix where Barrichello retired, spinning up on lap 59 of the race after he lost multiple positions and a lot of time getting the switch to slick tyres completely wrong, as he was on a one-stop strategy. Rubens overdrove the car chasing down Schumacher and binned it. Brundle meanwhile also spun off but was classed 12th under the 90% rule. So it wouldn't be until Argentina that a Jordan got some points on the board, Barrichello coming home in a respectable 4th in Buenos Aires, ahead of Irvine's Ferrari. Brundle was once again out of the race. This time he'd been drilled up the rear by Tarzan Marquez's out-of-control Minardi. But things had started to improve, if only briefly. Brundle got his first point on the board by finishing 6th at the Nürburgring, while Barrichello came home in 5th, and Barrichello finished 5th again at Imola, while Brundle once again retired. Spun off again. It's been written in various sources that Brundle was struggling with the 1996 car. By the time they got to Imola, the gap between the two had come down significantly in qualifying, but by this point of F1 history, left foot braking had been shown to be the way to go to get the lap times down. With left foot braking, you don't have to lift your foot off and get it onto the other pedal. There's no point where you're coasting. It's instant. Instant on, instant off. And as we'll discover in the retrospective on Martin when we get to it, he smashed his ankle in so badly in 1984 that braking with his left foot wasn't an option. He had to brake with his right foot. Brundle was also advancing in years, being 37, so injuries catching up with him and age wasn't going to help him in this then modern era. The Jordan wouldn't score again until Canada, with both drivers having a trilogy of non-finishes. Brundle spun off at Imola and Monaco, but then who didn't crash that day other than Hill and Alesi, and he lost the diff at Barcelona in the soaking rain. Barrichello meanwhile also binned it at Monaco, but then lost the clutch at Barcelona and then again at Montreal, retiring the car in the pits just as Martin was trying to pit for his first stop. Brundle would go on to finish 6th in that Canadian Grand Prix to get one extra point. It seemed though that by the time the F1 teams reached Silverstone, a race so local for Jordan the factory was across the road, they started to get on top of things. Also by this point in the season, the characteristic gold livery had come in, as that more yellow colour that they'd run in the early part of the season looked like ass on TV broadcasts, given the quality at the time, so they changed it to gold to stand out more. At Silverstone, Barrichello was 4th with Brundle in 6th, and Barrichello got 2 more points finishes in a row, both 6 places. Brundle would retire in spectacular fashion at Hungary, although not as spectacular as he had done at the start of the year, by bouncing across the gravel. And you know what the funny part about all this is? I've watched that 1996 season review videotape so many times, I don't even need to Google what they retired from. The last time both Jordans finished in the points was at the chaotic Italian Grand Prix, a video I did late on last year. That was the race that the FIA installed tyre stacks to replace those green and white bollards, and over the course of the race, several cars clanged them, including Damon Hill, who probably should have won that race and the championship there. Brundle and Barrichello meanwhile managed to come home 4th and 5th respectively, by simply staying the hell away from those tyre stacks. It would be only one of 2 times Brundle would finish ahead of Barrichello all year. But by this time in the season, Brundle had started to figure out the car and was just happy to be there, while Barrichello was suffering from rampant speculation about his future, because Ralf Schumacher had been announced for 1997. But while Brundle's performances were increasing, the Jordan was actually sliding back a bit. Death, taxes, and at least one of the Jordans starting 10th was the joke at the time, with one of the cars starting 10th at Germany, Belgium, Italy, Portugal and Japan. Compare that to the start of the season when Barrichello would, if the modern qualifying system was in place, be in Q3 more often than not. I make it at least 9 times in the opening 10 races. Following the German Grand Prix though, a Jordan never broke top 7 in qualifying again. At the final round of the season, Brundle took his last ever points in Formula 1, finishing 5th in Japan. As a result, Jordan finished 5th in the Constructors' Championship, which is actually on brand for Jordan, but considering how much further they wanted to be that year, the season was very underwhelming. In 1995 they scored a double podium at the Canadian Grand Prix, but in 1996 they weren't on the podium at all. But they did still score more points in 1996 compared to 1995. For the majority of 1996, Jordan was in danger of being beaten by Ligier, and when you look at Ligier's points finishes compared to Jordan's, you'll see that the only reason that Ligier were close to Jordan in the first place is because Panis had taken that win at Monaco. Take Panis' win off, and Ligier are only on 5 points and level with Tyrrell. It's amazing what those kinds of results will do for little guys, isn't it? Ligier actually scored points before Jordan that year, with Panis getting a point at Brazil while both Jordans were out, and then Panis getting the 10 points for winning in Monaco, which put Ligier on 11 points after that race, while Jordan had 8. It wouldn't be after Silverstone, where the Jordans came home 4th and 6th, that Jordan finally overtook Ligier in the championship. There was that brief moment in the season where Panis was like 5th or something in the Drivers' Championship because of that one single win. But following the heroics of that Monaco victory, he'd only score once for the rest of the season. Diniz meanwhile scored just 2 points all year. Panis got his final 2 points at Hungary, while Diniz's other single point came at Belgium. But the Jordan was not the improvement on 1995 they hoped it would be. They stayed in the same spot in the championship, they had no podiums, and they were the leaders of that second division that Formula 1 had at the time. Williams, Ferrari, Benetton and McLaren were Division 1, Jordan, Ligier, Sauber and Tyrrell were Division 2, and then Footwork, Minardi and 40 made up Division 3. I mean, putting 40 in Division 3 is being very kind. If Jordan was to capitalise on the new funding it had, it needed to get some better reliability and a better handling car, because for 1997 they'd have an all-new lineup. And some extra Peugeot reliability wouldn't go amiss, but actually they only popped an engine twice that year, Barrichello Australia and Brundle in Belgium. But a year and a half later, Eddie would finally get that elusive win at the Belgian Grand Prix of 1998. Okay, the circumstances were very similar to how Panis won in Monaco, but if you're Ligier or even Jordan, you take whatever you can get. But while the car in 1996 was very underwhelming, it did begin an almost decade-long relationship that produced one of the most iconic and recognisable liveries in Formula 1 of all time. And I really am talking all time, not just amongst the little guys. So then, a look at the Jordan 196 and how after the promise of 1995, 1996 left things underwhelming. Although it did begin an iconic partnership, so there is that. If this has been interesting for you, then do give the video a like so I know a good job was done. And for more stuff like this from the channel, get subscribed and also get the bell on so you never miss out on anything else that I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the rad lads over at Patreon for the continued support, and if you want to help pay the bills around here, as I will likely have to buy an image for this video, a link to Patreon will be down in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates and other bits and bobs you might want or need to know. Well, there's super thanks for one and done donations, and memberships for Patreon style support, but without going to Patreon. So until next time, I've been Aidan Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.